Hello. Stuart Hall argued that the cultivated rejection of mass culture is best understood as a thinly veiled attack on the masses. It follows that a hatred of popular culture portrays an antipathy to the people. While these two formulations share the same logic, their terms are not synonymous. Mass culture is not identical with popular culture, and the masses is not identical with the people. Masses, mobs, audiences, crowds, markets, publics, and the people, to name but a few, are each constituted differently. Likewise, the culture of the mob is not the culture of the public. Different mechanisms result in different assemblies. For instance, mobs assemble themselves relatively spontaneously in a certain place, whereas the masses are nothing but an aggregation of dispersed consumers of mass-produced goods. Crowds form around events, but exist outside them, whereas audiences disperse immediately following a performance. The people, therefore, is not another word for the masses, nor is it synonymous with the general public. The difference, I want to say, is not in the connotations of the words themselves, or in the way they conceptualize the social body, but in how each mode of the social body is formed, what mechanisms are used to form them, and to what apparatuses they belong. The people, I want to say, is not constituted by the people themselves, but is formed by the state. That is to say, the people is a specific mode of social affiliation required by the state. The state has other addressees, but I want to say the people has no other addresser. Clearly, this characterization of the people is quite distinct from that offered by Ernesto Laclau. The people for him is formed through the recognition of a battery of shared demands. What he calls the people is more usually called a class or a movement or a political constituency, depending partly on its extent and partly on the content of its shared demands. Rather than following Laclau's subversive recoding of the concept of the people, I think it's politically more promising to insist classically that the people is the collective addressee of the state. Attaching the people to the state is politically promising because it requires the critique of the state to find another name and another form of address for the collective subject of historical change. Artists and revolutionaries have one thing in common: they do not address themselves to the people. Revolutionaries divide the people, rigorously splitting its false unity into camps, classes, cadres, and forces. Unity is not uniformly rejected, but is deployed against itself. Securing the unity of revolutionary forces is the prerequisite of dismantling the ideological and operational unity of the existing social formation, designated by the state. In this formula, the people represents the social body subjected by the state. Artists cannot address the people as a whole without resorting to cliché, not because the people, as an allegedly empirical social entity, only understands cliché, but because the people is an abstraction that provides the artist with no specific addressee, no specific material basis for dialogue, no specific subjectivity to unfold. Artists, I want to say, address publics, not the people. Courtly decoration was the absolute form of minority culture until the French Revolution nationalised aristocratic collections in museums open to all free of charge. Art was reinvented as a public, universal, subjective, and above all, abstract category of culture, lacking purpose, having its own history, being timeless, only superficially constrained by geography, and so on. During the heyday of bourgeois revolution, when freedom, liberty, and equality were still proclaimed in the most absolute terms, art becomes art in the modern sense then only when it is extracted from privilege in the name of the people by the authority of the state. It was only historical art deposited in museums that was reorientated by the French Revolution to address the people. Romanticism and realism, the two movements that first responded to the bourgeois conception of art as universal and subjective, and to the bourgeois revolution, did not attach themselves to the people. Romanticism preferred rogues, bandits, rebels, outsiders and individuals with unique sensibilities and special powers. The human individual representatives of the worthless and the priceless as against the aggregate, the average and the normal. Realism rejected inherited truths, both dominant and popular, for facts, observation, evidence, and forensic scrutiny. Religious art, in fact, was never directed at the people, but to a quite different assemblage. It addressed believers or worshippers or the church. Popular culture never organised itself towards the people, but to a kaleidoscopic ensemble of individual consumers, technologically or spatially united as a mass. The people, if it can be assembled at all, cannot congregate through religion or commerce, but only as a political body, or more precisely, a non-political body constituted by political association. Civic monuments, war memorials and exterior mural painting are not always oriented towards the people, but if on occasion they do, then they constitute a specific anomaly within art. Socialist realism was an art of the people, not despite being official state art, but because of it. Greenberg was absolutely wrong to equate socialist realism with kitsch. His mistake was to conflate the people with the masses. The avant-garde of the Soviet Revolution allied itself to the working class rather than the people by inserting itself into industry and giving itself over to design. Soviet posters, however, assigned the people a revolutionary role. Lenin's policy of monumental propaganda, which was as aesthetically hopeless as it was politically expedient, was initiated with a decree issued by the Council of People's Commissars and given its brief by the People's Commissariat for Enlightenment. Although Lenin dismissed any talk about popular government erected by all, sanctified by the whole people, which comes from a speech to the All Russian Congress of Transport Workers in 1921, in the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat, Lenin's monuments nevertheless called forth a new revolutionary people through the depiction of assassins, insurgents and avant-gardists, through which the masses would see history as they walked through the city. That's from Susan Buck-Morse. This perambulatory politics can be understood as a technique for converting the masses into a people of the proletarian revolution and the socialist state. This anomaly, however, does not prove that art on the whole is an enemy of the people, to use Roger Taylor's phrase that Stuart Home applauds. While Taylor and others pay attention to the freighted use of the word art to mark cultural distinctions, he does not match this with a similar analysis of the term the people. Modern art is constituted, according to Andreas Hussein, through an asymmetrical dichotomy with mass culture, which can be associated with the people, but is clearly not a substitute for the people in Lenin's plan for monumental propaganda. This is a different conception of the people. Art has troubled relations with numerous vectors within the social field. This complex set of tensions and antagonisms cannot satisfactorily be reduced to the simple binary opposition of art on the one side and people on the other. As we know, however, the people is an enemy of the multitude. The people is the social body constituted by the state, whereas the multitude escapes the ordering principle of political identification. What would we call the social body formed by a process of universalization that exceeds the state, or is formed by the mode of social organization that comes after the state? What Dostoevskaya calls the non-state to be. Also, the people is the enemy of the public, since the latter is a participant in dialogical acts of publishing, including those associated with art and culture, whereas the former is merely subject to the state. And the people is the enemy of the mob, the blockade, the riot, and the kettle, since the concept of the people denies the disidentification that dissent enacts. The masses was not coined as a synonym for the people, Raymond Williams tells us. It was a new word for the mob, with its associations of, quote, gullibility, fickleness, herd prejudice, lowness of taste and habit. As such, mass culture is not the people's culture. Williams says the masses are always the others, and the term mass culture carries this meaning. But the concept of the people does not connote social alterity. A people's culture, on the contrary, would be our culture. Insofar as masses are other people, the masses are also other to the people, since the people has no outside except for other peoples. Therefore, the people's culture would be opposed to the masses. For cultural elitists, art was never understood as the enemy of the people, since art was always elevated by the ideology of the aristocracy as being and having the best. In effect, the aristocracy always saw itself as providing the best art for the church and civic space that would benefit the people too. If this coding of privilege as public-minded virtue does not quite capture the complexity of power at work in the aristocratic regime of art, the argument that art is an enemy of the people does not provide the missing nuance. Conspicuous antagonisms between modern art and both bourgeois and popular taste do not correct the mistake. Although modernism became a minority culture in Raymond Williams' terms, the enemy of the avant-garde was not the people, but more often than not, the bourgeoisie. It is true that the avant-garde punched holes in the social fabric and was chronically unpopular for half a century, but we must not forget that the campaign to drive a wedge between art and the bourgeoisie sent the avant-garde into the arms of the Philistines and the lovers of the circus, the cabaret and sport. Shock is the emblem of the antagonism between art and the existing social conditions and its cultural logic, but it's no basis for asserting that the avant-garde, or modernism, if that artificial divide still holds, was antagonistic to mass culture, the masses, or the feminine, let alone the people. Shock is the mark of art's modern negation of itself as a branch of culture bloated by money and power, in a world in which the abstract values that art represents, freedom, liberty and autonomy, risk becoming extinct everywhere else. Practices of negation in art are neither for the people nor against the people, not even by virtue of negating or nominating the culture that the masses or the markets prefer, since they address the assembled viewers and participants as the subjects of a particular kind of experience. I don't want to call this aesthetic or anti-aesthetic. To address people as subjects capable of either becoming wild in alliance with the avant-garde or going mad with indignation against it does not split the body politic between the rulers and the people, but splits an already divided culture. Art and its institutions do not manufacture a mass audience or import the masses from elsewhere, not even in the blockbuster exhibitions which are designed to capture thousands of tourists in several middle-sized rooms or a disused warehouse. If the combined audience of a dozen cinemas all spilled out at the same time into a public art museum, they would immediately lose their character as a mass and be reassembled as so many isolated decipherers, critics, connoisseurs, art lovers and debunkers. Contemporary art's ethics of participation addresses itself specifically to communities, not the people. It might appear as if the people, since it is a great abstraction, can be best experienced empirically piecemeal in the shape of individual local communities, but the people and the community are formed according to different mechanisms and processes. Williams built his politics of culture around the concept of our common life, and Thomas Crow wrote about the common culture. Here we have a political trope that might be preferable to the people. Recent thinkers have certainly taken refuge in talking about the commons when talking of the people might have diminished their readership. Nevertheless, even if artists belong to the commons or conscientiously organise themselves through the commons is never their addressee. The addressees of art are vital to its politics. Boris Groys has proclaimed the equal rights of visual forms and media, but what about the equal rights of all cultural subjects? I don't mean subject matter, I mean people, not the people, actual people. If we do not pay close attention to the constitution of art's collective subjects, and therefore the difference between the masses, the people and the public, then our artistic revolutions will be half-baked. Walter Benjamin's dashed hopes about how culture might be reconfigured as a result of the introduction of technologies of mechanical reproduction must now be reinterpreted as a collision between capital and anti-capital, not as the utopian content of technology, but the revolutionary promise of non-capitalist social relations. Neoclassical economics and liberal politics share the goal of converting individual preferences into social aggregates. The first is called demand, the second democratic will or mandate. An aggregate of consumers is a market that is a constitutive part of an economy. An aggregate of voters is an electorate that belongs to a state. Neither neoclassical economics nor liberal political theory conceive the aggregate of individuals as forming a public. In fact, both turn to anonymous mechanisms as replacements for discursive exchange, making discursive exchange redundant. Despite the numerous flaws in his formulation of the bourgeois public sphere, Habermas's concept of the public sphere as a mode of social constitution built on discursive interaction, opinion formation and value, rather than the mechanisms of state and market, is at least very suggestive for our conception of the collective addressee of art. A public, rather than the public sphere in general, is a specific social formation that contests among itself the values that form it in the first place. As such, although publics engage in practices that have costs and occupy institutions that are divided by economies of power, it is nevertheless the case that publics are constructed by discursive interaction. Neither markets nor states produce a public. Consumers have cash, voters have votes, but members of a public have opinions, make judgments, and hold values that they express through discursive interactions, not only through publishing well-constructed arguments, but also through applause, heckling, chanting, and booing. Thank you.